Well, good morning. Good morning, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Mark Cullen. I'm the director of our Stanford Center for Population Health Sciences, and I'm the incoming Senior Associate Dean for Research. You know, the pathway by which we translate the fabulous things that our colleagues here and elsewhere discover in the laboratory into potential therapies for both at the bedside and for public health decision making has become increasingly well defined over the past several decades, ranging from what we call T0 studies, which are those laboratory-based studies in which targets for treatment of human disease are identified, through stage T1, where the first efforts in humans are made to determine whether or not those targets are indeed reachable and can be done safely enough. And then a series of clinical trials ensue, which we'll come back and talk about. And subsequently, after efficacy is shown for a potential treatment, efforts are made to move that efficacious treatment into use, both, again, at the bedside and broadly through the medical community. Most of the attention up until now has been paid on the early steps in that cascade, where we imagine a chasm between the T0 and T1 stage, or to the very late stages of that cascade, where we talk about how do we get efficacious ideas, therapies, and so forth actually into the population where they might make a difference. But today we're going to focus on the middle, which has in many ways received somewhat less attention, which is the series of steps, first open and then increasingly well-defined randomized clinical trials, which are the way that we take potential therapies and demonstrate that whether or not they are efficacious. This process, again, which I think has overall tended to receive somewhat less attention, is itself quite important, and in the era of big data, one that I think deserves at least some reconsideration. And why is that? Well, for one thing, we know that although the chasms that have been identified are at the beginning and the end of the cascade, the clinical trials themselves are both incredibly expensive and take a very long time. Perhaps more important, we've discovered it's not that easy to recruit people for clinical trials. This is a problem that's actually gotten worse over time, and especially acute when we consider the importance of the many special populations whose inclusion in clinical trials, or absence of inclusion in clinical trials, has been one of the bête noires of our entire clinical research activity. But there are probably even more serious considerations that we need to think about. There are many problems that we can't study through randomized clinical trials. Imagine trying to study whether breastfeeding is a good idea. There are lots of ways to observe it, but it's not so easy to randomize. Or what the optimum weight is for good health. Again, not so easy to randomize. Even trying to figure out, for example, what it is about our physical activity may be beneficial or non-beneficial. Not so easy to randomize. And perhaps worst of all, as we move from the era in which we've operated now for the past several decades into the era of precision health, how are we to make randomized clinical trials appropriate for individual treatments, precise treatments as we advertise we are moving to be able to do? In any event, in the era of big data, there have been many, and I'm one of them, who've raised questions about whether or not observational work may ultimately replace or in part substitute for the roles that clinical trials have played up until now. And that's the subject of our next panel. It's my great pleasure to introduce Adrian Hernandez, who's visiting us today from Duke. Adrian, who was apparently called Tex by his friends growing up, is now the director of Health Services and Outcome Research at DCRI, where he's an associate director and he's PI on numerous very large clinical trials, a highly experienced trialist. And with no further ado, Dr. Hernandez.
Well, it's really great to be here. Actually, I did residency up the road at UCSF, and so one of the great things I appreciate coming back west is I can get rid of the tie, and so it's always great to come here to do that at least. But this is a great session, and as well as yesterday, and there's been a lot of focus about big data. And what I want to focus on is actually bigger trials. So big data actually allows us to start really thinking about how can we do bigger trials to get better answers across a wide range of people. But first, let me start with a story from my mother. So about 15 years ago, I was going with her to visit some family members in Alabama, and she started reporting chest pain. We were in the middle of really rural Alabama. She had really classic symptoms of angina, and it turns out, even though I was a doctor, she never thought that she should actually tell me that over the several months that she was having this. She ultimately got diagnosed with coronary disease, and she wound up having stents and eventually a CABG. But her first diagnosis of coronary disease was age 54. 2 years later, her brother, my uncle, died from an MI suddenly, a week before my wedding. And so that really had a big imprint on her, my family, in terms of cardiovascular research. It turned out that she actually really loved the idea that I was becoming a cardiologist, that I was actually going to do research to actually understand what should we do to make people's lives better. And very motivated to do that. She actually wants to be part of research. She actually wants to contribute to that. But there's a slight problem. So she also has a great love for 4 things. It turns out 4 boys, her grandkids, my 4 sons. And we depend a lot on her for that. Every day, after school, on weekends, and so. And so her life is such that she can't come to a site to actually donate data or blood or other things, but she's definitely willing to participate in research. And so as she's gotten approached for things, she's always turned almost everything down because it required so much of her and how her life would change. And so when a study came up around aspirin dosing, she was approached actually to help join a patient group for helping co-create a consent. So the first thing, though, that she noted was that she couldn't believe that we didn't know the dose of aspirin, that the study was actually trying to understand whether 81 milligrams of aspirin was better than 325. She remarked that she spent all this money on me in med school, helped support my lifestyle when I was in the Bay Area, and really was problematic that I was at Duke now, so-called #1 in cardiology in her mind, and as well as mine, yet we didn't know what the right dose of aspirin is. And she really wanted to be part of something like that, and so it did interest her. And then also even thinking in a bigger way, if you start thinking about simple questions that literally people can have important decisions over the counter, how can that translate to lives? And so in terms of the aspirin question, yearly, understanding what the right dose of aspirin can actually translate to what's a potential benefit for almost 20,000 deaths or MIs a year, or thousands of bleeds. And for her case, she actually has really concerns on both ends. So she breathes easily. She has 4 grandkids who are rambunctious and somewhat brutal, but yet she's really fearful of having an MI. And so she, in her mind, is worried about going with a lower dose of aspirin. So when you consider what it would look like for a traditional trial, it's pretty problematic. So looking at a recent cardiovascular trial, over 10,000 participants, requires nearly 500,000 visits. And that generates 2.5 million pages or more of CRF pages. That's over 30 million data points. And just thinking about things like other medications, over 300,000. And when you translate that, it's really hundreds of millions of dollars. How could you actually keep a system going if you're trying to answer simple questions that can have really huge value of information impact for people's lives when you have that? But what if you actually thought about a different approach, a system where actually takes advantage of the millions of people who are walking through our healthcare system every day, who actually have questions that they want answers, and actually assume that we're learning from them every day about their health and their healthcare and how to improve it for others. And what if you actually study their experiences in rigorous ways, inserting randomization perhaps to actually get the right answer, and then translate that immediately to the participants in that study and participants like them through those health systems? We certainly think that's possible. And over the last several years, we've been working on such a system and really focusing on how do we actually get people to join, to actually agree to be part of this, to sign up, to donate their data, to actually understand and want to be part of research, and then be able to choose what they participate in and have their data as it's being generated through health systems and the like for generating the research and the evidence. And so if you think about it, there's actually a lot between data and a patient. There's actually this thing called a clinician as well. And so actually having the full spectrum of patients, clinicians, and data in an ecosystem that actually has a national evidence generation system is important. And so really thinking about how you construct a system that has engagement, actually has electronic health records that are matched to a common data model, incorporates patient-reported outcomes and other health data streams, and then become a reusable platform for many questions and generating answers in a more efficient way. In 2012, actually, PCORnet met here in Palo Alto to try to address this issue. They noted among all the stakeholders that healthcare is fractured, that so is the research system, and it's too costly, too inefficient, and doesn't always get the answers that we want. And so the vision that came out of that turned out to be PCORnet being a large-scale research system focusing on informing healthcare decisions to be more efficiently done and using things that are really relevant to people's needs. This has formed now, and so we're actually using it. It is a community of patients, clinicians, and systems. And while there's a lot of attention to the big data, which there is, these other components are very vital for its success, for recruitment, for participation, and then ultimately implementation of results. And just highlights of the big data there, that's not the problem, actually, in a way. There are millions of people there. And if you just consider the people that walk through the PCORnet healthcare system doors, there's over 40 million in the last year that have walked through the system. So how do we engage them to be part of this? And when you think about further, the last 5 years, there's an additional 80 million people who've walked through PCORnet doors. And so that combination provides a great foundation for both real-world evidence generation with clinical trials as well as observational studies. And this literally translates into tens of millions of people. And when you consider the conditions there, it's actually across health, from the very young to the very old, common conditions as well as rare. And so just highlights of that, diabetes is a big problem. So just in the last year, almost 3 million people with diabetes here. If you consider a rare condition like ulcerative colitis, 100,000 encounters here. And so having a big funnel that can focus on rare conditions is important as well. So you're looking at how this is actually working now. The proof of concept is adaptable, addressing the aspirin dose question. And this is using what I call e-anything. So electronically identifying people, electronically screening them and enrolling them, electronically randomizing them, and then electronically following them up. And then for those who actually are not internet savvy, we can actually call them directly for this. But most people will generate the data, the results from their randomization as they walk through healthcare system doors or through their portal. And you can actually explore this. You can go to adaptablepatient.com and actually get a feel of what this is like. The first person randomized actually did it at his home. Others are doing it at their home with their family members or in their doctor's offices. So it's flexible. And what's a number mean? We're all about big data. Well, the number of 387,000, that's actually the number of people that have been identified and a subset of health systems that are actually participating in Adaptable, who are eligible for it, who we intend to reach out. And the number of systems, 27. There's not a clinical trial that has that few systems going after this type of large question. And the cost, $850 per participant. Again, an order of magnitude of what we're used to seeing. And what are the results? So what we're seeing is actually results that show that you can actually identify and recruit participants in a more rapid way. The average cardiovascular trial recruits 1 participant per site per month or less, and we're seeing 40, 50, 30. And the one thing is actually Duke can even do it, which is actually amazing. That is not necessarily our tradition, and so we're actually showing what is possible. And so for me, what does big data mean here? It's really the ability to have a learning research system, that we actually have something that's reusable that we can learn for the next trial. And we do it in a way that's engaging people in clinical organizations. And we do it with collaboration. So actually everyone's paying it forward, doing everyone else's research. And we're using something that has standardized data. Quality matters, and so making sure that's there. And also privacy matters, making sure that we have strong privacy protections. And we're trying to do this so that the results actually are meaningful to clinical practice. Doing it in the real-world clinical settings is really important. And finally, actually using randomization. There are people who have been quoted as saying, God gave us randomization for a reason, let's use it. And we should actually try to think about how do we do this integrated with systems, so without the burdens here. And this really translates into a bigger, higher value real-world clinical trials. So actually leveraging the big data for real clinical trials and actually generating big answers, hopefully. So thanks for your attention, and if you have more interest here, please visit PCORnet.org. And then also, we're actually starting a foundation, a nonprofit foundation, to house all this called the People Centered Research Foundation. So thanks again.